College students across the country are back at school. The spring semester was a very trying time for them, with many pro-Palestine protests fanning out and college administrators often unprepared to deal with the issue. It was especially trying for those who dissented from the majority viewpoint. Princeton professor Robert George believes all ideas should flourish and that students shouldn't hide and be quiet. He recently wrote about the issue of free speech for conservative students in a guest essay for the New York Times. He encouraged students who have been marginalized, even ostracized, for having different beliefs from the majority to speak out. These students include being pro-Israel and politically conservative.
The 40-year Princeton law professor has had a front-row seat to see how tolerance and diversity of ideas have unravelled on college campuses. That problem has become particularly acute over the last decade. As he writes, quote, "When you defend the robust right of free speech for all, you help to secure a central value without which the university cannot pursue its mission as a truth-seeking institution." Joining us now to dive into this, Robert George, Professor of Law at Princeton. Welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good to see you. So let's just jump right into this. I was looking for things to disagree with in your New York Times essay, and I couldn't find many of them because it seemed to me a plea for intellectual honesty as much as anything else, as well as that diversity of opinion. So beyond it being the start of an academic year, why did you decide to write this now?
Well, precisely because it was the start of an academic year, and I knew that students would be coming back to campus, and freshmen would be coming to university campuses for the very first time. And I had some idea of what they were going to face if they were students who happened to dissent from this or that prevailing dogma on campus, whether it has to do with Israel or economic issues or social issues. And I wanted to provide some advice based on my now nearly 40 years of experience for those students about how to navigate the situation they are going to find themselves in. Of course, the temptation is to lay low, to hide, to keep your mouth shut, to keep yourself out of trouble. But that's a mistake, because we have to remember our students are here to get an education. They have to remember that they're here to get an education. They won't be able to get an education unless they engage robustly with ideas, unless they're willing to say what they mean, say what they think, question prevailing dogmas, subject themselves to criticism, but also be willing to criticize views that don't seem to them to be quite right. Otherwise, we get an intellectual monoculture. Everyone's reinforced in what they already believe, and learning doesn't happen.
Well, what do you say to conservative students who privately are afraid to express their political views, think that they will be, if not just socially ostracized, have protesters coming after them? We saw some pro-Israel students actually, ejected from areas of some campuses, told they couldn't enter them during the encampment phase of what took place last semester in the spring, who don't want to be vocal because they fear reprisal.
Well, they're right to fear reprisals. I'm not going to tell you that if you follow my advice, everything's going to go okay and everything's going to be rosy for you and you're not going to have anxiety and trouble and issues. I wish I could say that, but that's not true. I recount in my op-ed some instances of students suffering real consequences as a result of speaking their minds. But what I want to say to these students is that it's worth it. It's worth it to take the risk in order to get this most precious of things, and that is a genuine education, an education in which, by practicing it, by exercising your right to it, you learn to think for yourself and to speak your mind. You learn to engage others in the kind of robust but civil discourse that enables genuine truth-seeking to go forward. And that's the whole purpose of a university. We do lots of other things. We do athletics, we do arts, and so forth and so on. There are political clubs on campus, there's this and that. But the reason that universities exist and the reason students should get university educations is to learn to be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers and lifelong learners. It is worth the risk.
And I think it's important to underscore, particularly for viewers who haven't read your op-ed, although you yourself are personally conservative, I didn't read the op-ed as a conservative plea or a conservative partisan plea at all. It really seems to me to be arguing against groupthink, to be arguing that it is important to push back, to receive, and to give alternative viewpoints. And the idea being basically that it is important to challenge orthodoxies from wherever they might arise, be that right or left. Is that a fair characterization?
That is an absolutely fair characterization. In fact, the belief in robust civil discourse, the belief in a diversity of opinions on campus, the belief in freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, freedom of discussion, those used to be old-fashioned liberal values. They're values that shouldn't mark somebody as a liberal or a conservative. Those are values that liberals and conservatives, despite their many other differences, should share precisely because they've got, I hope, a shared belief that it's better to know the truth than to persist in error, even if error is comfortable. And we're never going to advance toward a greater understanding of the truth if we shut down debate, if we allow groupthink to take over, if we become tribalists and outsource our thinking to our tribe or group or clan or political party or ideological community. No, we need to be able to think for ourselves, not a liberal value or a conservative value. It should be both a liberal and a conservative value.
Yeah, the changing landscape on college campuses now is such that I think free speech is often under siege from both political camps are less interested in having dialogue and discussion. For years now, it's become more common, I think, to hear that people are afraid of uncomfortable ideas on college campuses, places that should be almost safe spaces for the expression of contrary and controversial information. And a lot of the values from the campuses in the last 10 years or so, hostile, I would argue, to free expression, have then permeated, have gone out into the wider culture in terms of some corporate norms, some norms for social media companies, the idea that wrong speech or hateful speech or uncomfortable speech ought to be not protected or ought to be shunned. Can you talk about that from an intellectual standpoint, and how can college campuses counter this, to my mind, disturbing challenge to the values of a free society?
Well, looking at the campuses, it's certainly true that in some cases, threats to free speech on campus that are coming from off campus are coming from the right side of the political spectrum. In some states, there has been legislation or movement toward legislation that would prohibit the, quote, teaching of controversial ideas or some such characterization in state universities and public universities. And that's a genuine threat to free speech on campus coming from off campus. But when it comes to threats to free speech coming on campus, threats to free speech on campus coming from within the campus, that's much more often coming from the left. The pressure to have everybody think alike about issues such as, well, Israel, the Middle East, sexuality and marriage, abortion, environmental issues, some issues of economic policy. So you're right to say that there are threats coming from both directions, but if they're coming from the left, those are more likely the threats coming from within the campus. If they're coming from the right, they're more generally coming from off campus because there aren't that many people, certainly not that many professors on the right at university campuses in America today.
One final question, Robert. In terms of the broader culture in America right now, I mean, you talked there about threats in the sense of direct threats to freedom of speech. But one of the sentences from your op-ed that jumped out to me is, it is only by allowing oneself to be challenged that one learns to be discerning. It seems to me that in a whole lot of areas, including social media particularly, people's willingness to be challenged seems to me to be diminishing all the time almost. Are those kind of social currents things that you're also concerned about?
Very worried about that, because it's not just academic life that depends on tolerance of ideas and freedom of speech and willingness to be challenged. what we call Republican government, this great experiment in ordered liberty and self-government, depends on people being willing to engage their fellow citizens in robust civil discourse, treating each other when we disagree, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as friends with whom we happen to have a disagreement. And we're going to work that disagreement out by using the mechanisms, the constitutional principles of deliberative democracy. If we refuse to engage criticism, if we see ourselves as infallible, if we simply assume that the other side has nothing to teach us, then this experiment is not going to have a bright future. It really does depend on everybody's willingness to respect the rights to free speech of others and everyone's willingness to listen to arguments that challenge the point of view that they happen to hold at the moment.
Robert George, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.